To the sound of the waves of the Gulf of Guinea, we begin our journey in the Black El Dorado. At the end of the 1960s, the Seven Sisters, the major oil companies, controlled 85% of the world's oil reserves. Today, they control just 10%. New hunting grounds are therefore required, and the predators are turning their gaze towards Africa. With peak oil, Middle East wars, and the rise in crude prices, Africa is the oil company's new battleground.
When the Western world was developing its agriculture and basic industry, they needed an energy source, and that was human energy. And slaves were taken from Nigeria, from Africa. And now it's crude oil. So from the blood in the veins of the slaves, of Africans, from the palm oil, and now crude oil, it is one story of exploitation from one level to another. And honestly, this has to stop.
But the real story, the secret story of oil, begins far from Africa. In Scotland, in the heart of the Highlands, at Aghnacurry Castle on August 28, 1928. Under the pretext of a hunting party, 3 men have an appointment here: a Dutchman, an American, and an Englishman. This pheasant and grouse hunt was never filmed. There are no photos or archive records. But this is possibly how it happened. The Dutchman is Henry Detterding, an implacable and determined man nicknamed the Napoleon of oil. He runs the all-powerful Royal Dutch Shell. The American is Walter C. Teagle. He represents the Standard Oil Company, founded by John D. Rockefeller at the age of 31, the future Exxon. The Englishman, Sir John Cadman, director of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, soon to become BP. At the castle, the leading lights of the oil trade are seated, and their secret meeting can begin. The world needs oil, and the companies are engaged in a pitiless battle. War is perhaps good for business, but competition is not. Henry Detterding declares, "It is time to exploit, fraternally and to the greatest profit, the world's oil resources. Production zones, transport costs, sales prices. Everything must be agreed and shared." A secret pact is sealed, but with no signatures. The great oil cartel can prepare to dominate the world.
The Seven Sisters, 7 companies, dominated the petroleum industry at the time that the petroleum industry didn't just mean economic prowess and power. It was really an instrument of American and European, call it Western, projection of power in the Third World. That's what the Seven Sisters were supposed to be.
On this morning of August 29, 1928, the world order has changed. Other companies will join the billionaires' conspiracy. History will call them the Seven Sisters: Exxon, Shell, BP, Mobil, Texaco, Gulf, and Chevron. Minarets and flare stacks vie for supremacy in the Libyan skies. The burning desert, once scornfully dubbed the sandpit. In 1955, oil sprung from the dunes here, regarded by the oilmen as the best in the world. At the end of World War II, under pressure from the American oil companies, Great Britain and the United Nations installed Idris el-Senussi on Libya's throne.
In 1959, we discovered first well. It was Libya. Oil was, as a matter of fact, the whole oil industry in Libya was an American oil industry. Because Esso, in that time, find the first oil well, was the first to export oil, and was the first to produce it. In less than 3 years, Libya started producing more than 1 million. And in less than 7 years, Libya reached 3.5 million barrels a day. It was a phenomenon.
The Kingdom of Libya was an oil paradise for the American majors. The accounting was creative, to the extent that Libya received just 12 cents per barrel. As President Nixon and his advisors said in 1968, King Idris's regime was stable and secure because it was corrupt, truly corrupt. The tankers laden with the finest quality black gold could therefore sail unheeded towards the American coast. Well before the majors, a French geologist, Conrad Killian, knew about the potential of Libya's oil fields. He spoke of himself as a man who speaks to stones. After 2 expeditions in the 20s, he confirmed that oil existed in the Sahara and Libyan Fezzan. He was the only man in the world with a map of the Sahara's potential oil reserves. In February 1941, General Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli at the head of the Afrika Korps. The same day, he sent his tanks against the British positions, driving them back as far as Egypt. His campaign plan was simple: to open up the access to the Middle East oil fields, and then to join up with German forces from the east, who were supposed to capture Baku and its fabulous reserves. The war in the North African deserts was a battle for oil.
And they were talking about that there is oil in Libya, and as an irony, Italy and Germany were fighting the Allies and then suffering from the shortage of oil, while beneath their feet there is a huge reserves of oil. And they lost the war because of the shortage of oil.
Back in France, Killian attempted to convince his government his finds were authentic. But only the British Secret Service seemed interested, perhaps too interested.
C'est là qu'il y a eu le spectacle de M. Killian qui s'était pendu à l'espagnolette. Disons qu'il avait la tête à cette hauteur, le buste qui pendait, les jambes en avant.
Killian was found hanged in a seedy hotel room in Grenoble on April 29, 1950, suspended from a window latch 120 centimeters off the ground. He was 185 centimeters tall. Despite signs of blows, the verdict was suicide. In the aftermath of World War II, France is rebuilding. Dominated by the Anglo-Saxon corporations, it has to gain energy independence. It therefore turns to its colonial empire. A handful of geologists, perhaps remembering Killian, took the wild risk of searching in the Algerian Sahara, a desert bigger than France itself. Men from CFP and ERAP, the forerunners of Total and ELF, began the long search.
Pour les Français, pour la stratégie pétrolière française, il était important de trouver du pétrole dans l'Empire français, dans les colonies françaises ou dans les ex-colonies françaises, parce que c'était du pétrole payable en francs. Et donc, une fois l'indépendance achevée dans les pays africains, il reste dans la zone franc, et donc c'est important d'avoir du pétrole payable en francs français.
After 4 years of fruitless drilling, oil finally sprung on June 16, 1956, at Hassi Messaoud. 3,000 meters underground lay one of the biggest oil fields in the world. On that June day, France became a major oil producer.
En 1954, il y a déjà la guerre de libération qui a été déclenchée et la question pétrolière va amener le gouvernement français à revoir sa stratégie vis-à-vis de la guerre d'Algérie, tout simplement.
L'Algérie a fait des obsèques solennelles aux victimes de la vague d'attentats.
The attacks and riots, euphemistically called the events of Algeria, turned into the Algerian War, a war for independence. curiously, the war seemed not to affect the Sahara. Foreign Legion troops camped close to the oil wells, but the FLN and Algerian rebels made no real attempt to sabotage the wells or the pipelines, as if wishing to preserve their future inheritance and spoils of war.
La découverte du pétrole va modifier la géographie même du pays, tant et si bien qu'il y a même eu une proposition du gouvernement français qui a été faite au FLN en 1957, dans laquelle il était proposé que le Sahara continue à être territoire français et qu'il y ait un couloir large d'un certain nombre de quelques kilomètres entre Hassim Saoud et Béjaïa, dans lequel seraient posés tous les pipelines d'évacuation du pétrole vers le nord, et les parties à l'est et à l'ouest de ce couloir devaient constituer l'Algérie indépendante.
The oil issue and France's proposal to separate the Sahara from Algeria plagued every attempt to find a peaceful solution. Oil from the Sahara fed France and Europe, and the war raged on for 4 long years. Talks were finally initiated between France and the FLN in Evian, and an agreement was signed on March 18, 1962. Algeria obtained full sovereignty over the Sahara and its riches, in exchange for certain guarantees concerning French oil supplies. In the heart of the desert is Hassim Saoud. With its 1,500 inhabitants, a chapel, a gendarme post, bakery, post office and swimming pool, no expense is spared on the new capital of French oil. Oleander bushes, palm trees and eucalyptus grow alongside the 300 wells. 14 million tons of oil are produced here, and the flare stacks light up the desert night. Despite independence, Hassim Saoud remains a French enclave, exploited by French companies. Profits are enormous, and the party is in full swing. But it's the last one. The Algerian president, Boumediene, turns off the music.
قررنا ابتداء من هذا اليوم باش على كل حال الثورة الاشتراكية تدخل في قطاع اللي هو كان قطاع خاص يعني حتى واحد ما يمسه وهو القطاع البترولي. قررنا تأميم النقل البري يعني كل الأنابيب اللي هي خارجة من الآبار هذه تصبح ملك متاع الدولة.
On the morning of January 24th, 1971, France wakes up with a hangover. The Algerian president has dared to commit the unthinkable. For the first time in history, Algeria's oil is nationalized. Unlike Total, which accepted the new conditions, ELF abandoned Algeria. But France had to organize its oil future. 2 men emerged from the wings. A former Gaullist Secret Service agent, Pierre Guillaume, director of ELF, and Jacques Foccart, a friend of General de Gaulle and an advisor on African affairs. Their mission is clear: to find oil in Africa and ensure France's energy self-sufficiency. The adventure began here in Gabon in 1956. In the marshy delta of Port-Gentil, where the river Ogooué flows among mahogany and ebony forests. The first prospectors discovered oil at Azuri and Point Claret. 1 year later, the tanker Le Ronsard left the Cap Lopez terminal and set sail for Le Havre. Gabon became a protectorate of the French Republic, run by Jacques Foccart and ELF in collusion with President Omar Bongo. ELF defined its own diplomatic relations with the blessing of the French government. Gabon without France is like a car with no driver. France without Gabon is like a car with no fuel. Bongo reportedly repeated that as a friend to France and all its presidents.
C'est Elf, avec la France-Afrique, qui ont imposé Bongo au Gabon pendant 40 ans. Ce n'est secret pour personne. Pour travailler tranquille. Et qui a bénéficié de ces largesses, la largesse de Elf? Ben, c'est Bongo et sa famille. C'est clair, ce n'est pas la population. Je ne trouve pas d'excuses, je ne trouve pas de raisons. Je ne trouve pas de justificatif pour ne pas qualifier ce qui s'est passé au Gabon, particulièrement, pour ne pas le qualifier de génocide économique entre les multinationales et les dirigeants gabonais imposés par les mêmes multinationales.
But it didn't stop there. ELF extended its influence to a large part of Black Africa, giving birth to what would be known as Francafrique. Nigeria, Chad, the Congo, Cameroon, Angola. ELF would fund a variety of regimes and guerrilla movements. A pragmatic diplomacy where slush funds flowed in every oil-producing country on the continent. With bribes and embezzlement, ELF made fortunes for its executives and a few African leaders.
En dégageant plusieurs milliards de francs de caisses noires, les satrapes africains et les dirigeants d'ELF ont fait bien plus que de détourner de l'argent. Ils ont créé du malheur. C'est l'Afrique qui a financé une grande partie de la vie politique française, mais dans l'affaire ELF, ce financement représentait quelques pourcents. Le gros des détournements a fait la fortune des cadres d'ELF et de leurs amis.
Sea, sand, and the African sun. The daily life of the oil expatriate seems leisurely. But in a country of barely 1 million inhabitants, the daunting dependence on oil makes daily life difficult. The tomatoes come from South Africa and the potatoes from Paris. The state goes begging to the IMF. The oil money is gone, evaporated. The party is over. After 8 years, thousands of hearings and statements, the ELF affair is concluded. The verdict falls in November 2003. Loac Leflac Prigent, former CEO, André Telaro, the Corsican-born Monsieur Africa, and Alfred Sirven, the special ops man, extradited from the Philippines. All three are sentenced to prison. For its crimes, ELF is bought by Total. The French company joins the Seven Sisters private club. Libya, September 1st, 1969. With King Idris absent for medical treatment, a group of officers staged a coup d'etat, and Muammar Gaddafi proclaimed a new Libyan Arab Republic. He was just 27 years old. For the Seven Sisters, the wind of change ushered in by Colonel Gaddafi would soon attain hurricane proportions. In 1970, he nationalized Libyan oil and, against all expectations, raised the price of a barrel by 30%. In just a few months, the Seven Sisters were facing a serious enemy.
Gaddafi gave a speech in the opening of the discussion. And he said one important word or sentence. He said, Libya lived 5,000 years without oil, and it is ready to live another 5,000 years without it. That was a big, big blow. The oil companies found out that we were serious. And to prove this, we cut the production from oil companies.
Off the coast of Tripoli in the Gulf of Gabes lies the Bouri oil field. It's the largest in the Mediterranean. Gaddafi needed money to pay for his revolution. Oil would supply it. He also funded freedom movements around the world. Oil money would support the fight against imperialism and the Palestinians' cause. In 1982, the United States decrees a commercial embargo against Libya. Regularly renewed and intensified, that embargo would last until 2004 and seriously penalize the Libyan oil industry.
I think we could fairly say Libya was enemy number one of the major producing companies, especially the American companies. And one of the accusations against the country, especially in the 70s and the 80s, was that Gaddafi, armed with so much money from the oil revenue, is actually spreading terrorism around the world.
Along the Costa Esmeralda is the town of Olbia, where the turquoise waters are studded with luxury yachts. It's here that we find His Excellency Sheikh Zaki Yamani, one of the most emblematic figures in Arab oil history.
I was against raising the price of oil so quickly because it was against the interest of the Arabs and the oil producers. Maybe this is my crime. I don't know.
On December 21st, 1975, a group of 6 gunmen entered the OPEC headquarters in Vienna. 11 ministers and dozens of their colleagues were taken hostage. Their mission was to assassinate the Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Yamani. Leading the commandos was a Venezuelan, Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, known as Carlos.
Carlos and me, we were talking, joking, and so on. I mean, he was very kind to me, but he told me that he's going to kill me.
The commandos demanded a plane to fly to Algiers and then Tripoli. Gaddafi refused to accept them, and the hostages were finally released in Algiers.
Some people said because they want to kill Sheikh Yamani because Sheikh Yamani was in the hands of the Americans and they play for their interest and cutting the price down and increasing the production and helping IEA to build a big stocks to affect the oil price. Yamani, some people think that he worked completely against the interest of the Arab people and of Palestine and of OPEC. But if these people, but nothing happened to Sheikh Yamani. Sheikh Yamani was released and nothing happened to him.
Was there a deal? Sheikh Yamani will not say. In his prison cell, Carlos stated that Gaddafi was the instigator of the hostage-taking. We leave the Sheikh and head for Sudan on the Red Sea. There, too, oil has fueled war. This is the story of the Seven Sisters cartel, a group of companies that dominate the world's petroleum industry. Exxon, Shell, BP, Mobil, Texaco, Gulf, and Chevron. It began with a secret meeting between 3 top oil traders back in 1928 and a secret pact to start exploiting the world's oil resources. When Sudan became independent in 1956, the Arab elite in the north seized power in Khartoum. The southern regions were marginalized. The black African peoples in the south, Christians and animists, claimed autonomy for their region. And so began a civil war that would last almost 20 years.
Tout le monde pensait qu'il pouvait y avoir du pétrole au Soudan. Personne n'en savait rien. Ça a été révélé par l'exploration de la compagnie américaine Chevron à la fin des années 70. Et ça a été le début de la Deuxième Guerre civile qui ensuite a duré jusqu'en 2002. Ça a duré 19 années. Et cette guerre civile a coûté au moins 1,5 million de morts. Donc l'affaire pétrolière est au cœur de la situation.
Blood and oil. Officially, Sudan has the 5th largest oil reserves on the African continent. But the majority of the oil fields are in the south. For Khartoum, war was inevitable, with its plague of horrors and massacres. The authorities in Khartoum were accused of genocide and crimes against humanity. In this context, the Chinese stepped in.
In this competition between the United States and China, it is often claimed that China behaves by different rules than by the United States and the Europeans. They don't have the NGOs scrutinizing their behavior, and they're not as much concerned by human rights. So in places like Sudan, they've developed a close relationship with President al-Bashir, who has been implicated with massive human rights violations.
Sudanese oil is vital for China's growth, and China has been generous to the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir. As a benefactor, China is an interested party. It's a strategy with few scruples, just another way of doing business.
也就是说，我们经常强调的这种人权观里边，其中一个发展观，这是我们经常强调的。就是说，如果这个区域或这个国家它没有经济发展，谈什么权利啊？首先，经济发展起来以后，那么，这是一个最基本的。如果连生存发展权都没有，那你谈其他的这东西就是比较有点像比较虚幻啊。
The Chinese builders move in. President al-Bashir can be proud of his cooperation with China. A dam on the Nile, roads and stadiums. In order to export 500,000 barrels a day from the oil fields in the south, China financed and built the Hejlij Port Sudan pipeline. South Sudan's oil is shipped to the Middle Empire's ports.
Les Chinois ont amené des esclaves. Alors ça a été une opération assez étonnante. Plus de 25 000 travailleurs qui étaient des condamnés à des peines de droit commun, qu'on a extraits des prisons chinoises, qu'on a amenés au Soudan, et on leur a dit, voilà les gars, voilà des pelles et des pioches, au boulot.
In a dramatic shift after 50 years of civil war, the unthinkable happens on a February morning in 2010. By a huge majority, Southern Sudan obtains its independence. A new country is born. How will the oil revenues be shared out between the two Sudans? The question would spark off further conflict. The Western companies, the Seven Sisters, would re-enter the stage. But the Chinese are already well established.
Le Sud a 85% du pétrole, mais la seule voie d'évacuation de ce pétrole pour l'exportation vers l'étranger, c'est au Nord. Donc le Nord a le robinet, même si la source est au Sud.
Back in Gabon, in the shadow of the Cap Lopez oil terminal, the African night is balmy. It's a new three-handed game. The Majors and the Seven Sisters are not alone here. The Chinese like Africa and show it. $10 billion in investments and loans over the next 3 years. Gabon needs a lot of money. The Seven Sisters have their work cut out.
Quand l'État convoque les compagnies pétrolières, c'est pour leur dire, écoutez, nous sommes en on a besoin d'argent, essayez de nous avancer de l'argent, point. Aujourd'hui, l'État gabonais est presque sous perfusion. Ce sont ces multinationales qui injectent l'argent dans les caisses de l'État. C'est-à-dire, on peut même dire que le pétrole gabonais est hypothéqué.
Point plié, s'il vous plaît. Point droit plié. Point droit plié. Ensemble, unis dans la concorde.
A strike by workers at Total. Protests are organized at the Cap Lopez terminal. But there are few illusions. No one can defy the oil giant on its own ground.
À chaque fois qu'il y a des mouvements à Port-Gentil, mais c'est l'armée française qui va mettre de l'ordre. Vous voyez, toute cette répression, vous avez la pression militaire, la répression et des techniques de corruption généralisées qui font en sorte que même quand la population veut se lever, ça ne marche pas.
It's impossible to sail around Port-Gentil without running into the French army. Boarding today is relatively courteous. The Navy's 6th Infantry Battalion is in charge of the installation's security. Their motto is, "In the name of God and the colonial troops." Life insurance for the Gabonese regime and the oil facilities. In this Gabonese El Dorado, where Bongo Jr. succeeds Bongo Sr., with the oil company's blessing, all that's left is a precarious well-being. Everything else has been stolen. On the western flank of Africa lies the Gulf of Guinea. In the past 20 years, oil production has doubled here, a new El Dorado.
On the 500 Naira Nigerian Naira notes, you find an oil platform, an oil rig, where the money for the prosperity of Nigeria has come for the past 50 years. But today, the people of Nigeria, the people of Niger Delta in particular, have no benefit from the resources from this oil that has produced this Niger. This is the heart of the crisis of Nigeria.
The center of the crisis here could be Makoko, a lakeside shanty town in Lagos. With makeshift houses on fragile stilts, it's the last refuge of outcasts, excluded from oil benefits. They squeeze into the slums of Africa's biggest metropolis, Lagos. The air is rife with the rank smell of cooking fires and foul, stagnant water. The stench of poverty. As always, it's a magnificent adventure. In the hostile jungle, men build iron cathedrals, delve into the entrails of the earth, and the first flare stacks spit out their fetid breath towards the heavens. In 1956, Shell opened up the flood of Nigerian oil, the country being a protectorate of the British Crown. The first tanker loads of oil headed for Europe, as had palm oil and cocoa before it, and long ago, slaves for plantations in the New World.
So quite frankly, the relationship between the Nigerian people, particularly those who call themselves leaders, and the oil company, the five major, is that of master-servant relationship. The oil company are the masters in Nigeria. The Nigerian people are now the servant to the oil company. It's a tragedy.
Le Biafra, qui a été le premier grand conflit qui s'est produit après les indépendances sur le continent africain, était un conflit instrumentalisé par des puissances occidentales qui souhaitaient tout simplement s'accaparer les terres à pétrole du Nigeria. Les Ibo ont été soutenus par de nombreux pays occidentaux, la France en premier lieu, qui cherchait à l'époque à mettre pied sur ces terres à pétrole. Elle s'est soldée par la mort de plus d'1 million de personnes.
On May 26, 1967, the region of the Christian and animist Igbos voted for independence from the central government, controlled by Muslims in the north. The Republic of Biafra was declared, triggering an appalling and murderous civil war. The new Biafra held 2/3 of Nigerian oil reserves. De Gaulle and Elf provided arms. It was one way of weakening the influence of the British companies, BP and Shell.
Elf a perdu la guerre du Biafra et c'est les compagnies britanniques qui l'ont emporté. C'est les compagnies britanniques qui ont emporté, c'est BP et Shell.
Africa's leading oil producer, Nigeria, is known as the African elephant. With 35 states, 250 ethnic groups, and over 160 million inhabitants, more than half the population attempt to survive on less than $1 a day. In Lagos, the former capital in the south, Christian churches abound, with Pentecostals, Baptists, and Adventists seeking to relieve both souls and pockets of rich and poor alike. Many here have another, more derogatory name for the black gold.
I disorganize them and uproot them in the name of Jesus.
Well, if it is the seed of God, I don't know that God that would, inflict that sort of harm on its own people.
The Niger Delta, 7,000 kilometers of oil pipelines, 1,500 wells, tons of leaking oil burning the mangrove and men's skin. Massive pollution, bravely denounced, but in vain.
Les Ogoni sont un peuple de pêcheurs qui ont toujours vécu dans la mangrove et qui finalement tiraient leurs ressources des ressources halieutiques du delta du Niger. Le jour où Kensawiwa a constaté que les criques commençaient à être polluées, qu'il y avait de plus en plus de pipes d'oléoducs qui fuyaient et crachaient leur merde du diable dans les criques poissonneuses de cette deuxième mangrove au monde, qu'est le delta du Niger, Kensawiwa s'est lancé en lutte.
Ken Saro-Wiwa and Ogoni denounced the collusion between Shell and General Abacha's dictatorship. He accused the oil company of polluting the environment and not sharing its staggering revenues with the local population. He succeeded in mobilizing thousands of people, and the pressure forced Shell to stop production. On the company's request, the demonstrators were violently repressed by the police and the Nigerian army. There were hundreds of fatalities. Ken Saro-Wiwa was arrested and sentenced to death. On November 10, 1995, in Port Harcourt, Ken Saro-Wiwa was hanged, along with 8 of his comrades.
Everyone knows that Shell Petroleum Development Company was complicit in the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa. They were complicit because they, for the most part, instigated a lot of the crisis, which ultimately led to the arrests, trial, and hanging of Ken Saro-Wiwa.
A rough trail, built by Shell to transport its workers, leads out of Port Harcourt and to Shell's facilities in the Delta. Filming is forbidden, and there are frequent army roadblocks. In a country making millions, the water is undrinkable, the land unworkable, and the air unbreathable.
Now we are not having a benefit. Oil is coming from our land, and the benefit is not given to us. Police, the army are employed by the oil company to defend them. It's not we. Even if when we go to lay our complaint, they will drive us. Even when we are annoyed and block their way, the army will come. Sometimes they lock our children.
And so emerged the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, or MEND. With kidnappings and armed attacks, the movement combines illegal action with political claims. In 2008, it forced a 25% reduction in Nigeria's oil production. The world's crude prices soared. The government was obliged to propose an amnesty.
There will be violent conflicts since about 2005 or thereabout, kidnappings of people. They will kidnap people and then they will pay ransom. Government was paying, oil companies were paying. They paid the militants to protect the pipelines. So the business was booming. But it got to a point where the violence was getting a bit more intense and oil production was dropping. It dropped, really, really dropped. And so the singular purpose of the government in trying to stop the violence is to let the oil corporations open up the markets again. It is not an interest to sustain peace in the region. It's not an interest of cleaning up the oil spills or developing the region. It's simply to allow more oil to be extracted.
Oil may be flowing into the holds of huge tankers, but in Lagos, petrol shortages are chronic. The country's 4 refineries are obsolete. The continent's main oil exporter is forced to import refined petrol, a paradox that reaps fortunes for a handful of companies. Encouraged by the oil companies, corruption has become a system of government. Some $50 billion are estimated to have disappeared out of the $350 billion received since independence. In July 2003, George W. Bush chose Nigeria for his first African visit. By 2020, with its high-quality reserves, Africa should be supplying 25% of America's crude oil.
Several African governments face particular dangers from terrorists. And the United States is working closely with those nations to fight terror. And we will do more. I propose a new $100 million initiative to help those governments in East Africa protect their people and to fight terrorist networks.
The United States, for reasons of energy security, seeks to diversify its sources of supply. And Africa looks very appealing because it's another option, an alternative to the Middle East, number one. Number two, Africa is right across the Atlantic from the United States.
Africa is the new El Dorado for the United States and the Seven Sisters. So peace had to be made with the main producer, Libya. Too bad if Colonel Gaddafi was a criminal. Business came first. The former pariah of the international community was clean again. Oil business realism. The country opened up, and its oil became the main attraction. All the experts agreed it's the most promising producer in Africa.
Well, some people say things that there is a contradiction in the policy that, for example, President Bush once, and even before him, they look at Libya as one of the axis of evil or whatever. Then second day it become a friends. Of course, this is due to the fact that these countries have no friends and have no enemies. They have interests. We know that they are not because they love us, they come here. And we know that not because we love them that we allow them to come here, but there is a common interest for us. It serves our interest. And there is, in oil industry, it is a win-win situation for both of us.
In 2003, Libya officially acknowledged the responsibility of its officers in the Lockerbie and UTA 772 attacks. In a cunning move, Gaddafi paid more than $2 billion in damages to the victims' families. The colonel's bet paid off. The sanctions were lifted. He was no longer persona non grata, an arrangement made of oil and dollars.
You have a queue of Western oil companies coming into the country. Okay. Any sensible, reasonable politician in the UK or in the United States, for that matter, would think twice about causing any harm to the relations with Libya because of the oil interest, mainly the oil interest.
Abdel Basit al-Megrahi, sentenced to life imprisonment for the death of 270 people in the Lockerbie attack, was freed by the British in August 2009 for humanitarian reasons. According to the Sunday Times, his release was linked to the signature of an important oil contract with BP. For Downing Street, this was merely a coincidence.
And oil must have been in the mind of the people who settled the issue of al-Megrahi. I'm sure of that.
Muammar Gaddafi welcomed al-Megrahi as a hero on the Tripoli runway. Blood, dollars, and oil, the price to pay for the Seven Sisters' return to Libya. For the Seven Sisters and their competitors, Chinese, Indian, Russian, Italian, and French alike, the hunting season in the Black El Dorado was open once more. But not even the sisters could have foreseen the events of February 2011, when the Libyan people rose up against their brother leader. By October 2011, after months of hiding, the colonel was lynched by a mob of his own people. His oil minister, Shokri Khanem, who was interviewed for this film, had fled to Vienna during the fighting. In May 2012, he was found dead, floating in the Danube River. Austrian authorities say it was a heart attack. Libya is back to pumping more than 1 million barrels of oil per day. It needs the money to rebuild after the civil war. And the sisters, they're happy to oblige. The American is Walter C. Teagle. He represents the Standard Oil Company, founded by John D. Rockefeller at the age of 31, the future Exxon. The Englishman, Sir John Cadman, director of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, soon to become BP. At the castle, the leading lights of the oil trade are seated, and their secret meeting can begin. The world needs oil, and the companies are engaged in a pitiless battle. War is perhaps good for business, but competition is not. Henry Detterding declares, "It is time to exploit, fraternally and to the greatest profit, the world's oil resources, production zones, transport costs, sales prices. Everything must be agreed and shared." A secret pact is sealed, but with no signatures. The great oil cartel can prepare to dominate the world.
The Seven Sisters, seven companies, dominated the petroleum industry at the time that the petroleum industry didn't just mean economic prowess and power. It was really an instrument of American and European, call it Western, projection of power in the third world. That's what the Seven Sisters was supposed to be.
On this morning of August 29, 1928, the world order has changed. Other companies will join the billionaires' conspiracy. History will call them the Seven Sisters: Exxon, Shell, BP, Mobil, Texaco, Gulf, and Chevron. Minarets and flare stacks vie for supremacy in the Libyan skies. The burning desert, once scornfully dubbed the sandpit. In 1955, oil sprung from the dunes here, regarded by the oilmen as the best in the world. At the end of World War II, under pressure from the American oil companies, Great Britain and the United Nations installed Idris el-Senussi on Libya's throne.
In 1959, we discovered first well. It was Libya. Oil was, as a matter of fact, the whole oil industry in Libya was an American oil industry. Because Esso, in that time, find the first oil well, was the first to export oil, and was the first to produce it. In less than 3 years, Libya started producing more than 1 million. And in less than 7 years, Libya reached 3.5 million barrels a day. It was a phenomenon.
The Kingdom of Libya was an oil paradise for the American majors. The accounting was creative, to the extent that Libya received just 12 cents per barrel. As President Nixon and his advisors said in 1968, King Idris's regime was stable and secure because it was corrupt, truly corrupt. The tankers laden with the finest quality black gold could therefore sail unheeded towards the American coast. Well before the majors, a French geologist, Conrad Killian, knew about the potential of Libya's oil fields. He spoke of himself as a man who speaks to stones. After 2 expeditions in the 20s, he confirmed that oil existed in the Sahara and Libyan Fezzan. He was the only man in the world with a map of the Sahara's potential oil reserves. In February 1941, General Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli at the head of the Afrika Korps. The same day, he sent his tanks against the British positions, driving them back as far as Egypt. His campaign plan was simple: to open up the access to the
Middle and basic industry. They needed an energy source, and that was human energy. And slaves were taken from Nigeria, from Africa. And now it's crude oil. So from the blood in the veins of the slaves, of Africans, from the palm oil, and now crude oil, it is one story of exploitation from one level to another. And honestly, this has to stop.
But the real story, the secret story of oil, begins far from Africa. In Scotland, in the heart of the Highlands, at Aghnacurry Castle on August 28, 1928. Under the pretext of a hunting party, 3 men have an appointment here: a Dutchman, an American, and an Englishman. This pheasant and grouse hunt was never filmed. There are no photos or archive records, but this is possibly how it happened. The Dutchman is Henry Detterding, an implacable and determined man nicknamed the Napoleon of oil. He runs the all-powerful Royal Dutch Shell. To the sound of the waves of the Gulf of Guinea, we begin our journey in the Black El Dorado. At the end of the 1960s, the Seven Sisters, the major oil companies, controlled 85% of the world's oil reserves. Today, they control just 10%. New hunting grounds are therefore required, and the predators are turning their gaze towards Africa. With peak oil, Middle East wars, and the rise in crude prices, Africa is the oil company's new battleground.
When the Western world was developing its agriculture,